All right. Shall we stand for the reading of the bracha? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Hashem natan Torah. Blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who gives the Torah of truth and the good news of salvation to his people Israel, and to all the people through his Son, Yeshua, the Messiah, our Lord.
Amen.
Amen. Chag Sameach. You guys know what Chag? All right, yeah. Chag is holiday. Sameach means happy. All right, so holiday happy, it's the way Hebrew works. All right, so we have had the fortune to be able to gather at the time of Purim. So we're going to take a little break from our mock study, and we're gonna discuss the story of Esther. How many of you know the story of Esther? Stick of your hand. All right, pretty much everyone. Fantabulous. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this interactive then. Okay, instead of listening to me drone on, and we'll go through all the chapters, and when we know the story, I want to know from you, we'll do a short summary, and then I want to know from you, what really stuck during this time? When you guys went through it, many of you go through it before you celebrate, which is a good practice. Before every feast, you go and you study it out. And you ask God to show you kind of what he wants to reveal to you, right? So when we look at Esther, where is the story based? In Persia, right? And Esther was her real name, yes? No, what was her real name? Hadassah, all right. And Hadassah had an uncle by the name of Mordecai. And where were they staying? You can't say Persian Empire, it's kind of large. In a house. Susa, right, the capital. Right. Now, when was the Book of Esther kind of written, more or less? A little bit later. Let me ask you this. So you're going to give me the exact date. Do you guys remember in the times? So let's do a little bit of a history study to kind of give you a base timeline. Okay. So what we have is Israel becoming a nation. They go through judges, and eventually you get to a king. King Saul comes in. He starts off really good, does a pretty bad job. Then we get David. David does a really good job, but he makes a couple of boo-boos. Then we get Solomon, and then we get Rehoboam. And fast forward down to a split in the kingdoms. And once the northern territory, the 10 tribes, and the southern territory of Judah, we have an Assyrian empire that comes down after many warnings and takes the northern 10 tribes of Israel and scatters them. Who comes to take the southern kingdom? Because they didn't listen either. Babylon, right. But did they do this all in one fell swoop? No. There were 3 exoduses from Jerusalem and the territory of Judah. 3 times. People came, they were taken, and they were moved. The first group of people you can earmark with a famous prophet. Who was the first guys? They were young, they were good looking, they were quite wise, they were part of some royal lineage, and they were moved to Babylon first. Who were they? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Or Daniel. Right. So Daniel and them, as they went with these other boys, and they were established over there. They were part of the first Exodus. All right. There were 2 other Exoduses that followed. The last one being with a king who decided to revolt, and the last thing he saw was his sons being put to death, and then his eyes were put out. Remember his name? Zedekiah, right? So what we have, complete and utter destruction of Solomon's temple, and we have people dispersed all over the world, but we have people sitting in Babylon. We're there for how many years? 70, right? Because God said, you did not let the land rest for 490 years. So because of that Shemitah cycle, we are going to let the land rest. And if we do that, 490 divided by 70, well, divided by 7 will give us 70, correct? You guys with me? Okay? If I lost you with the numbers, just remember, God said they will not be there for 70 years. Okay? And it has something to do with the Shemitah cycle, the sabbatical years. When they come back, do they all leave at once? When Cyrus, the Persian king who really deals with this Babylonian empire and establishes that, and he sends out a decree, you guys can go home now. How did they leave? They also left in 3 waves. The first group being led by someone from the lineage of David, Zerubbabel. Him and Yeshua, the high priest, went and they went to go and establish the temple. Ezra was next, and he was the Torah scribe, the Torah teacher, and he came and he brought Torah once the temple was sort of going, and the last guy came in and he put walls in. What's his name? Nehemiah. Right. Now, set the stage. People have been back for a while. Then we get to the story of Esther. So the first question you should have is, if God allowed them to come home, why didn't these guys leave? Why are they sitting in Persia? Well, Persian Empire, should I say. Why are they sitting in Susa? Amy?
I think I can come up with something.
Do it.
So you spoke about when people don't want to leave an area, it's generally for the wealth or innovation.
Right, because they're comfortable, because they're wealthy, because they have got a good lifestyle. And we're kind of comfortable where we are. We have our culture now. So remember we spoke about how American Jews really love Biltong and Breifleis, even though they identify with the land of Israel. Right? This sort of thing. We're happy where we are. We're comfortable where we are. And then God goes, you probably should have left a while ago. But they didn't want to. So God, which is one of the most fascinating things about this book, how many times is God mentioned in the Book of Esther? You know that they nearly left this book out purely because of that very fact. So people will look at it and they say, well, look, you study the Book of Maccabees. Why the Book of Maccabees? It's a historical document. It tells us a story. So Esther, why do we include Esther and we leave out Maccabees? Because there's this amazing play that is running in the backdrop. And this is one of the big things I want you to take away from today. Throughout the story, we get so lost in the bride, this lady getting chosen and lifted up and beautified, and then to the point where now she has to lay down her life. And that's kind of where we go, all right, this is the culmination. But the real story has this God that is allowing situation to kind of mold and test reaction to see what they would choose. You know, sometimes in our lives, we are so focused on our situations, we forget God is above those. So we're sitting over there and we're looking at where we are, we're looking at our workplaces, we're looking at our family, we're looking at the difficult choices you have to make. And you ask yourself, where is God? I want you to remember this book. Because no one can deny that God was in the midst of everything that was going on here, to the point where, as we will discuss later, this becomes a foreshadow of what Messiah does for us. But this becomes a reminder that sometimes God will be there, but he might not necessarily poke through the clouds and tap you on the shoulder and goes, don't worry, I got this. We don't hear of a prophet telling her outright, God says, go to the king, everything's going to be fine. We don't hear of a voice from heaven saying, okay, guys, don't worry, this is the case. We don't really get illusions to why Haman is being like Haman. But we have to study the scriptures to figure out exactly what's going on here, and everything shows us pictures. Those are the things I want to explore with you today. All right, so we have guys that are very comfortable sitting in this Persian Empire, and God goes, all right, let's use that. You guys remember the backdrop? How do we get Esther into power? What goes wrong in the beginning? Shoni?
For about 180 days, the king Xerxes as a banquet festival before they go to war, and he called for Queen Vashti to come. She refuses to come.
All right. Okay. So what we have is we have a bride who refuses to be paraded. Many different ways to view that. And she outright refuses an instruction from the king. Now, I want you to spiritualize that for a moment. Those who have been chosen before who refuse to obey a Torah, an instruction, fall out of favor. And a new bride or gets chosen. Does that sort of make sense to you? So Vashti decides she refuses to get paraded. You know, when we must take a moment just to think of the type of wealth that must have been flowing around here. Can you imagine the type of money when we have a party for so long over which, was it just in Susa? It was through 127 provinces. Everybody's been partying for that amount of time. Now, someone give me a little bit of historical understanding when we deal with good old Xerxes or Achashverosh. Who is he? Someone other than Shoni. All right, I'm going to use a really weird reference, okay? How many of you have ever had, well, let me not say anything. How many of you have watched 300? This is Sparta. You know that really weird king, the one who comes to take on Sparta? That is actually built on this biblical character. Historically, and I'm not saying Sparta is historically accurate, well, the 300 story, part of it is the Battle of Thermopylae did happen. They just really made it a little bit, let's just say they used poetic license with a lot of the stuff. So what we had is we had a king who was powerful. And he came up against the Spartan army and he lost. And he's got a little bit of egg on his face. He's struggling with. It's almost as if the end of this era is coming. And Xerxes, Achashverosh, was one of the most powerful. Actually, in Daniel, he was prophesied about. So when we see this guy coming into the fullness of his authority, we need to understand that this man was chosen for a time like this. I know we apply that a lot to Esther. Just like Cyrus, Xerxes was called before he knew he was called. So God had already ordained that this guy was going to pitch up. And he did. So we have this man, we go into this moment, he gets rid of Vashti, he has this wonderful, this wonderful idea planted in his mind, let's get all the pretty girls and let's pick a new one. And that way we won't have any rebellion in our house, and all the men say, yes, please. And all the women go. And we have this moment where another interesting character gets put into play. Who was the one who helped Hadassah? Not Mordecai. in the palace? Who was he? Right, the chief eunuch was sitting over there and she found favor, and he sort of coaches her a little bit on how things go, right? She found favor in his eyes, and then he's there and he's looking at this and he goes, well, actually, let me help you out here with this king. So eventually she takes counsel, she listens to some instruction, and then she becomes queen. And then all of a sudden we get this wonderful backdrop going with Haman lurking in the background. Now, where did Haman come from? He's referred to as an Agagite. What's that? A descendant of Agag, right? That's a pretty simple analogy. And where did he come from? Why? Why is that important?
Samuel was tasked to go and kill. Okay, well, Amalek attacked. If we take away that, Amalek.
Don't worry about that one. Focus on Samuel and who was the king at the time.
So Samuel was the king of Saul.
Right.
And Saul was told to go and kill the Amalekites, to kill everything there, and leave nothing alive. And then he left the king alive and some animals alive. And that was when God tore the kingdom from Saul.
Okay, so King Saul, through an act of disobedience, Agag, where it talks about, it says it gave him some kingly rights. And that probably meant that he had some ladies with him, and somewhere along the line someone got pregnant, and the Amalekites were not cut off because they attacked Joshua and Moses and them when they were in the wilderness. He says, I'm going to deal with these people right now. And it was disobedience, a king who refused Torah. And this is one of the mistakes Saul made. And he lost his kingdom because of these mistakes. But because he didn't, we are now dealing with an Agagite, hundreds of years later, who is bent on destroying the Hebrews. Does it sound like he says, you guys, does it say anywhere really that because you shamed the great King Agag, now I'm going to wreak havoc against you? Was that his motivation? No, what was his motivation? Mordecai didn't bow down to me, he doesn't show me homage, and it was all about him. And in the midst of it, we've got another little character whispering in his ear, it's not just Mordecai, let's get rid of all of them. Who would we attribute that voice to? Hasatan's busy playing games, and in the backdrop, he's not mentioned by name. That's a lot of self involved. But on the other side, we have God looking at the plans unfolding, and he goes, all right, well, let's deal with this. He knew this was coming. He put the king in place. He puts Hadassah in place. He puts Mordecai in place. He puts the chief eunuch in place, and he's going to string together a story of salvation. So we come to a culminating part. Haman gets this decree issued, and Ahasuerus is having a rough time. He doesn't want to talk to anybody. He doesn't want to deal with anybody. So he says, I'm not going to summon any of my wives. Well, I'm not going to summon my wife, let's say it that way. And then Mordecai says, but you've got to go and talk to him. Hadassah says, if I walk into that room, I'm as good as dead. So what do they proclaim? What happens? What do they do to support her? A fast. How long was the fast? 3 days and what? And 3 nights. Don't forget that part, because it kind of gives you a little inkling of crucifixion and resurrection type of scenario here. Right? So what do we have here? We have when everybody's fasting for 3 days and 3 nights, and the entire people refuse to be comforted, because if this does not work, there is going to be a complete annihilation, a genocide of a people. Is this the first time the enemy has tried to do this? No. We have a modern day example of when we want to take everything that is identified as a Hebrew or a Jewish person and say, you're the scourge of the earth, we're going to destroy you. We call that the Holocaust. This was not the first picture of where the enemy tried to cut off the lineage completely. And why would he be fighting so hard to cut off this lineage? He's not going to save you. Sean is not going to save you. I want you guys to think. Why? No. That's partly, but why else? We're communicating good today. It's a feast, it's okay, they must scream, shout for joy. Who's supposed to come from this lineage? The Messiah. So if I get rid of the people, then what? No Mashiach, no salvation. Why is there 3 days and 3 nights so important in this fast? 3 days and 3 nights so that I would be found acceptable before the King. She takes a big breath. She pushes open the doors. The guards are lined up. If the king does not extend his scepter, if he does not look at her and goes, you are worth living, that's where the story ends. Put yourself in her shoes for a second. How many of you are willing to lay down your life so that others may live? Her identity has been hidden. She could survive. She could say, oh, well, we're just going to carry on and, some of them are going to escape and don't worry, this isn't my problem. But she did it for the benefit of everyone else. She didn't do it for herself. I want you to think of Christ. For 3 days and 3 nights, will I be accepted in front of the King? How do we know he was accepted? He rose from the dead. He was resurrected. He didn't do it for himself. He did it for you. She stands there and she slowly walks towards, this is my death sentence. If I die, I die. But no one can say I didn't try. And thankfully, there's a moment's pause where Achashverosh looks and he goes, and he sticks out something. What does he stick out? His scepter, his symbol of authority. And he finds favor, and you can imagine her relief. And what does he say to her? He says, what do you want from me? I'll give you anything up until half of my kingdom. How many of you would have been sitting there with your lucky lotto lists? Well, since you're so generous, the castle's a little drafty, and can I please have some more attending? Oh, and by the way, please stop trying to kill all my friends. But what was the biggest thing that she wanted?
She was there with the old human hammer.
That was a precursor. That's what leading up to it. What was on her heart? Salvation. Purely to be safe. Purely to be saved. I mentioned this to you guys in December. Sometimes we get so busy focusing on what we want that when we come into the presence of our King, and even though he looks at you with love and he's giving you favor because Christ went before you, and we look at him and he goes, what do you want? Even half the kingdom I'll give you. And then we start giving him a to-do list. You haven't even been fully saved yet. Christ did the work, but you have to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. If it was already sorted, then why am I still working it out? Because I can walk away from God at any given time until that time when I face Him. I can make those mistakes. I can choose to throw away the gift of life, and I can choose to live for myself. God forbid. But I take aim at the fact, and I take courage in the fact that Messiah died for me so that when I move forward boldly into the throne room, and I look to my King who says He will give me from His authority favor. What is your request? Grant me life, Lord. That eternity that you promised, can I be part of it with you? Can I have the fullness of what you promised? And not just for me. Think of Messiah. For everyone else behind me. Our biggest heart's cry should be, please, Father, get me home. My King, this is the only way we're going to be able to do this. Let me be with you. Let me be safe. Let me be yours. She was queen. She already had power. She already had stuff. She already had all of that. And she disguises this request for salvation with a simple meal. If I found favor in your eyes, can we have dinner together? How many of you take for granted that your spouse and you sit together? That's her request. Can we eat together? And then we hear something really bizarre. Bring Haman too. How many of you would have been like, I'm going to get this brother alone, and then we're going to talk about this guy. You've got a snake that is busy whispering in your ears. You need to get rid of him now. And she goes, no, he comes too. Makes me think of Messiah sitting at a Pesach Seder, looking at Judas. I'm giving you every opportunity, brother. Why aren't you grabbing it? Why are you hanging on to this hate? Why are you hanging on to yourself? Why are you just so focused on everything that is? If someone doesn't give you acknowledgement, they're not the problem. If you get your identity from people, we have the problem. And it's not good enough that we go, all right, we've eaten together. She says, the king again looks at her and he goes, what do you want from me? I'm going to give you half the kingdom. And she goes, come again tomorrow. Can we do this again tomorrow? What a gift to sit at the king's feet and share a meal. Everything is okay. That's Middle Eastern custom. If we can sit together and we can eat together, that means we're good. You understand the relationship, the cost? Christ was not there just to get you through the front door so that you can touch the scepter. He wasn't there just to get you to the throne room, but he was there so that your salvation would be secure, so that you can sit and eat a meal with your king. You as the bride. That is your privilege. And we stand and we watch with bated breath as we get to this place where she starts to reveal the plan. And if we're finished with that story that Haman, we've got this weird little setup in between there where Mordecai gets lifted and elevated, and there's some prophetic word that actually comes out of Haman's house that, well, Mordecai's 1 year going down, brother. And that comes from his own family, and we go, okay. And as it was said, Haman is gone not long after that. but the after effects are still there. There's a decree of death that's going to run through 127 provinces. How do we get there? How do we deal with this? This decree cannot be nullified. I want you to think of the law and sin and death. How do we stand up to this? Well, there's another decree that comes. Stand firm and defend yourself. How do we defend ourselves? What do you think they had? They had swords. So let's spiritualize that a little bit. What's your sword? The word. It's another decree. It's an instruction. And I stand holding on to what God has said so that I can stand before them and I can say, I am not moving this day. For today, the King has decreed life. And God, in their midst, allows them to win victory after victory. You see, sometimes we got to stand, and as much as the king is in the background and he's going, fight. How willing are you to stand in the midst of a battle, your life, and take your sword and fight for your life, for your salvation, so that you too can acknowledge and understand that you're part of his kingdom. There's four things that I just want to reiterate in this story. God is nowhere to be seen. He's not really heard. Not directly, but he's always there. The heart's cry of the bride. You. Even if he's willing to give you half the kingdom, we should just look and say, Father, all we want is salvation. All her other needs were taken care of. Everything her heart desired. But please save me. And save the people with me. That should be our cry. I want to highlight again that the disobedience of one king affected generations and generations after him. We need to remember that sometimes if we don't take up a call, it's going to affect not only us, it's going to affect our families. It's not only going to affect our families, but it's going to affect the children, should God tarry, the people who come behind you. Our disobedience leaves repercussions, consequences, bad ones. But our obedience, well, that's going to ripple through and that's going to change lives for generations to come. The last thing is understanding who you are. If we strip away the names and we understand that Hadassah is a picture, a foreshadow of the bride of Christ, and he's sitting in the throne room of heaven, you by yourself will not walk into the throne room and demand an audience from no king. But yet, because of his love, he extends a scepter to you, so that you understand that you have a privilege that is not afforded to many. If that was anybody else, if Mordecai tried to walk in there, even though he saved the king's life, the story would have been very different. Because she had found favor, because she understood what he liked and what he didn't like, because she took instruction. And this is something that struck me this morning while I was thinking about it. The eunuch, in a way, is sort of a type and shadow of Torah. It helps us understand our king. The scepter, in a way, is a type and foreshadow of Messiah himself. That which I reach out to and I hold on to so that I can come into the presence of the fullness of the God Elohim. And the throne room is heaven. So if I take my instruction and I live by it and I apply myself, I find favor in his eyes. When I walk into the throne room and I hold on to Messiah, understanding that I'm only there because of him, but I also understand who he is and who I am not. Even as the bride, I need to know my place. And my place doesn't scream orders, even though I'm the queen and I have authority in my own right. Yeah, you might do. But understand that God is the highest. Understand that he is the one who allows you to be there. And it is through his love and his favor that we can boldly walk in to the throne room because of the blood of Christ, because of the Father's love, and because our heart's cry is not a list of things. It's not about my gimmies and my desires and my wants from a worldly perspective of what I should be, but it should be about salvation and eternity with the King, and with the kingdom of heaven being established with people, the most treasured possession, that I, as a representative of my people, can stand before him and say, Father, but them too. The queen did her job. Mordecai did his. And the people that came after had to do theirs. You with me? I hope that was unmeant, busy. All right, you guys want to add anything to this narrative? What struck you about the story?
So just two things as well. One, with the eunuch, it was be the Holy Spirit who guides us.
Also could be, yeah.
Then when you were paralleling the two people that came before, also Shemaiah, who was following David, and how he was actually Mordecai actually came from his bloodline.
Okay. I see.
So just a genealogy to that. And David's grace, when he said that he's just paranoid, Mordecai came through that. So it's just nice to parallel.
You guys know what Bruce is talking about? Just a minute.
So there's a guy named Shemaiah. Do you know? A second. Sheni. So Sheni was the guy that was busy mocking David when he was walking down the road and was looking at him, and David's people said, listen, must be kidding me. He said, no, just did it be. Mordecai came from his lineage. Whereas Saul was supposed to kill the Amalekites, and from there Haman came. So because of grace, Mordecai came through. Because of disobedience, Haman came through.
No.
Where's that scripture with Sheni?
So Sheni, S-H-E-N-I. I'll find the scripture for you and give you the reference.
Right. Anything else you guys want to, anything that highlighted? Sorry?
So for me this time, what struck out to me is this lady that was of no, she really had nothing. She had no royal status before she came to king. She had no authority, she had no high status, she was just a normal
Yeah.
person.
No real lineage.
It was like, God can use, you mustn't think that you can't use because you don't have status or you don't have, he has and purpose for your life. And that's just what I mean this one, that she had no status before she.
A lot of the time we don't identify with God's plan because we forget that we belong to Him. Right? So by no rights in ourselves could we have any claim to anything in heaven. And yet He says otherwise. That we should have a relationship with a perfect God and be perfect before Him. All of us shudder to think because how many times have we fallen short? How many times do we think we're not good enough? I was sitting at in the wilderness one night in Israel. We were in Mizpah. And I like to take guys out there at night. So, it's a little town, so there's very little light backdrop behind you. And it's just open expanse and nothing. And this continual thing, and I'm sure you guys can identify, with the vast expanse of the sky before me, I felt really small, insignificant. And I kept on asking the same question, Father, why me? You ever feel like that? You know what the answer is? Come on. Right, there's no, because it is. Yeah, I chose you, let's move on. Why me? I chose you, can you please move on? But why? How many times? It's like, just go back to what I said 5 seconds ago. What did I say? Because I chose you. Yeah, but why? Let's just go back to that thing 5 seconds ago. We struggle in ourselves because we don't see what He sees. And then we go, Father, if you really knew me, if you really knew my sin, if you really knew my brokenness, if you really understood all the horrible things that I've done in my life, I don't even accept me. He goes, I was there while you were doing it, but I chose you anyway. So can we move on? We get stuck in our past trauma and we don't focus on our future because we don't forgive ourselves. Isn't it weird that the King of Heaven forgives you and then we still hold on to it? Can you imagine if Esther Hadassah was standing there and she goes, you've been chosen as queen, and she goes, I'm not a queen. The gown and the crown might say otherwise, but I'm not a queen. Can you please go and be queen? But I'm not a queen. She would fulfill her role quite badly if she didn't identify with the clothing shift and the crown on her head and let the reality sink in for a second. Are you letting that reality sink into who you are? If you truly believe that He died for you, that all sins have gone, let them go. He doesn't remember them, so you shouldn't. If you truly believe that you have been transformed and you've been changed, that you are the bride of Christ, act like it. You are not some nothing and nobody in the middle of a place where you look around and you go, but I'm nothing special, I have nothing to contribute. You are His peculiar treasure. If He says you're special, that means you are. Cool?
The thing that struck me about the story that I was thinking about is what made the king choose her about the other woman? Why was she more pleasing to him? And it's only because she followed the eunuch's instructions. That was the only thing. I mean, there was a lot of beautiful women there. I mean, they chose hundreds of the most beautiful women in the country. She wasn't necessarily physically, definitely the most beautiful woman, but something about her made her more beautiful in the king's eyes. Only because she specifically followed the eunuch's instructions. And she did what was pleasing in the king's eyes.
Yeah.
So for me, when I'm following the word and following the Holy Spirit, and I'm doing what's pleasing in the king's eyes, that'll be more pleasing and bring more joy to him. So that's kind of what I was thinking along those
Yeah.
lines.
And we have that parallel, right? When Vashti disobeyed. And because of it, she lost favor. Because of it, she lost her place. And because others obeyed, she kept the favor. Okay? Now, what I'm not saying is that there's any sort of weird replacement theology thing, you guys know me. But there is a point where because of our disobedience, we will walk away from our salvation. Right? Scripture's quite clear. But if you want to still be in relationship with God, if you still want to be favorable to Him, if you still want to please Him, obedience helps you keep that relationship going. It's because of that favor that we stay in covenant, we stay in that relationship. It is not a self-righteous belief. But if you get married, you might not do everything perfectly, but you better try. If you love that person, you are not focused on how you feel, you're focused on how they feel. Christ wasn't thinking how when he started to focus a little bit on what he was going to face in the Garden of Gethsemane, did that make him happy? Did he struggle a little bit? Father, is there any other way? Let this cup pass. I think he prayed 3 times, and it wasn't just to tell you about the pressing, it was also to tell you that he was also looking at this going, maybe there's another way. And he gave us a simple golden rule. So did Hadassah. If this is the only way, let your will be done. I'm going to take a step out in faith. And I'm going to hold on to the fact that this is not the end. This is the beginning. And if I can do this, how many people behind me will I save? You have no idea how many people are watching you, how many lives you impact. Question is, what are they going to see? Are they going to see a bride that wants to please the king? Or are they going to see someone who throws a tantrum when they don't get it? All right. Anybody else?
What is verse scriptures? 2 Samuel 16.
2 Samuel 16. All right. You guys all happy?
Yes.
So we can go and eat cake? Yeah?
Okay, so this was what was confusing the history of Saul and the goddess and
Mm-hmm.
so 1 Samuel 15 verse 33, Saul, 1 Samuel 15, Saul united to kill Agag. In verse 33, Samuel kills King Agag.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so what's confusing is it looks like they're all dead, but then in 1 Samuel 15, David comes up against them and again. So do you think that when Saul was going up against them, and he was just maybe going up against the army and the king, he wasn't actually he wasn't being killed like a whole nation?
It's a difficult narrative because we don't get given all the pieces. One process was that because Saul afforded Agag kingly sort of rights, is that, again, he allowed a woman to be with him. And so they might have eliminated everyone, but a lady escaped, and later she gave birth. And that's why generations passed before we see the elevation of an Agagite come up again. So it's a possibility. All right?
It say the scepter represents?
It could be a foreshadow of Yeshua, the very righteous thing of authority that we hold on to be able to do with me. Yeah, it's sort of a Psalm 110 narrative. All right, shall we pray? Father, we just want to thank you for this time. Father, we know this is not a Leviticus 23 feast, Father, but we want to commemorate this as a time of memorial. And we can just remember what you did, Father. If you did not intercede at this point, if you did not show favor, Father, point these people at this specific point to basically foil the enemy's plans, Father, we would not have Messiah today. We wouldn't probably have Torah either, Father. So we just want to thank you. Thank you for the gift. Father, we don't fully understand how hard you have worked to keep the people alive, Father, so that we could receive the blessing. And Father, how you continue to preserve your truth through the Ruach, Father, and through the written word, and because of the blood of Messiah, Father, that we and the people behind us could come into the kingdom. Please help us, Father, when we get stuck and fearful, when we don't see or hear from you, Father, help us remember Hadassah. Father, may we also remember that you have chosen us, that we are your peculiar treasure, Father, and as we come boldly into the throne room, that we would remember the words, that we would eat together, and that we would be safe for us and the people there, Father. So we just want to thank you. Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for opening up our eyes. Thank you for your instruction. So, Father, that we could be safe with you. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen.